The morning dew was still settling on the Montana grassland when Marcus Riley heard the soft rustling coming from his tool shed. At first, he thought it might be a raccoon, or maybe one of the neighbor's cats that had wandered onto his property. But as he approached the weathered wooden structure, coffee mug in hand, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The door, which he always kept securely latched, was slightly ajar, and there, curled up in the corner on a pile of old horse blankets, was a woman with dark auburn hair, sleeping so deeply she didn't even stir when the morning light hit her face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Marcus didn't know was that this woman had traveled over 1,000 miles to reach his shed. She had no identification, no belongings, except the torn wedding dress she wore, and officially, according to everyone who knew her former life, she was supposed to be dead. 3 weeks earlier, in the bustling city of Chicago, Elena Vasquez was preparing for what should have been the happiest day of her life. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in her cramped studio apartment, adjusting the simple white dress she'd bought from a discount bridal shop. The dress wasn't the elaborate gown she'd dreamed of as a little girl, but it would have to do. At 26, Elena had learned that dreams often came with compromises. She had met Richard Blackwood through an international marriage agency 6 months prior. The correspondence had started innocently enough, letters exchanged between Chicago and her hometown of Guadalajara, Mexico. Richard's initial letters painted a picture of a successful businessman looking for a devoted wife to share his life in America. He described himself as lonely, hard-working, and ready to provide for the right woman. His photographs showed a well-dressed man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile. Elena's own situation had made Richard's proposal seem like a gift from heaven. After her father's death 2 years earlier, she had struggled to support her younger sister Maria and their ailing mother. The small seamstress shop where she worked barely provided enough income to cover their basic needs, and the economic situation in their neighborhood was deteriorating rapidly. When Richard offered to bring her to America as his bride and promised to send money to help her family, Elena saw it as the answer to her prayers. The marriage agency had facilitated their meeting during Richard's business trip to Mexico. He had been charming during their brief courtship, taking her to expensive restaurants, buying her gifts, and speaking tenderly about their future together. He paid for her visa processing, her flight to Chicago, and even sent money to her family before she left. Elena felt grateful and hopeful as she boarded the plane to her new life. But the man who picked her up from O'Hare Airport was not the same person she had fallen for during those magical 3 days in Guadalajara. The first sign of trouble came during the car ride to what Richard called their new home. His demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the warm, attentive man who had courted her. In his place sat someone cold and controlling. He barely acknowledged her attempts at conversation, and when she asked about the small ceremony he had promised, he laughed bitterly. "We'll get to that when I decide you've earned it," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge she had never heard before. Elena felt a chill run down her spine, but she told herself it was just nerves. Perhaps Richard was tired from work, or maybe he was as nervous about their new life together as she was. The house Richard brought her to was nothing like what she had expected. Instead of the comfortable suburban home he had described in his letters, they pulled up to a run-down duplex in a rough neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. The paint was peeling, the small yard was overgrown with weeds, and several windows were boarded up. "This is temporary," Richard said curtly as he grabbed her single suitcase from the trunk, "until you prove you're worth investing in." Inside, the house was sparse and unwelcoming. The furniture looked like it had been salvaged from garage sales, and there was no warmth or personal touches anywhere. Elena tried to make conversation about decorating and making the place feel like home, but Richard cut her off. "You're not here to redecorate," he said firmly. "You're here to work and to do what I tell you to do. The sooner you understand that, the better this will go for both of us." That first night, Elena lay awake on the lumpy mattress in the small back bedroom, wondering what she had gotten herself into. Richard had made it clear that she would be sleeping alone until they were properly married, but something about the way he said it made her stomach turn. The next morning brought the true reality of her situation into sharp focus. Richard woke her before dawn and led her to the kitchen, where he handed her a list of household chores, written in his precise handwriting. "This needs to be done every day," he said. "Breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, dinner at 7. The house needs to be spotless at all times. You'll do the laundry twice a week and the grocery shopping on Sundays. I'll give you money for food, but you'll account for every penny." Eleanor looked at the extensive list, which included tasks like scrubbing the floors on her hands and knees, washing all the windows weekly, and maintaining a vegetable garden in the backyard. It was more work than seemed reasonable for one person, especially in a house this size. "Richard," she said carefully, "this seems like a lot. Maybe we could—" The slap came so quickly she didn't see it coming. Her head snapped to the side, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut her lip. "You'll call me Mr. Blackwood until you've earned the right to use my first name," he said, his voice deadly, calm. "And you'll never question what I tell you to do again. Do you understand?" Elena's hand flew to her stinging cheek, tears welling in her eyes. This was not the man she had agreed to marry. This was not the life she had been promised. "I understand," she whispered. "Good. Now get started on breakfast. I like my eggs over easy and my bacon crispy. And Eleanor?" He waited until she looked at him. "If you're thinking about running back to Mexico, forget it. I have your passport, and I know where your family lives. It would be very unfortunate if something happened to them because you couldn't follow simple instructions." The threat hit Elena like a physical blow. Her sister Maria was only 19 and still in school. Their mother depended on the money Richard had been sending. If Elena ran away, not only would she likely be deported, but her family would suffer the consequences. Over the following weeks, Elena's life settled into a routine of fear and servitude. Richard left for work early each morning, but not before, inspecting her previous day's work and often finding fault with something. He would dock her allowance for perceived infractions, money that was supposedly being sent to her family, but which Elena suspected was never actually mailed. The physical abuse escalated gradually. First it was just slaps when she didn't move fast enough, or when dinner wasn't to his liking. Then came the shoving and the grabbing that left bruises on her arms. Richard was careful never to mark her face or anywhere that would be visible. If she went to the grocery store, Elena tried to reach out for help, but Richard had isolated her systematically. He controlled her access to the phone and the internet. He drove her to the grocery store himself and waited in the car, timing her trips to make sure she wasn't talking to anyone. He had convinced her that as an undocumented immigrant, her visa had expired shortly after her arrival. She had no legal protections and would be arrested if she contacted the police. The psychological abuse was perhaps even worse than the physical violence. Richard had a talent for making Elena feel worthless and dependent. He constantly criticized her English, her cooking, her appearance, and her intelligence. He would compare her unfavorably to American women, telling her she should be grateful that someone like him was willing to take care of someone like her. "Your family sold you to me," he would say during his crueler moments. "They took my money and got rid of their burden. You think they want you back? You think anyone else would want you?" Eleanor began to believe him. The confident young woman who had boarded the plane in Guadalajara, slowly disappeared, replaced by someone who jumped at shadows and apologized for breathing too loudly. The breaking point came on a cold February evening. Elena had been living in Richard's house for nearly 4 months, and the situation had grown progressively worse. Richard's business, which she had learned involved some kind of illegal gambling operation, was apparently not going well. He had been drinking more heavily and taking his frustrations out on her with increasing frequency. That particular night, Elena had prepared Richard's favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans. She had spent the entire afternoon cooking, making sure everything was perfect, but when Richard came home, he was already in a rage about something that had happened at work. He took one bite of the pot roast and threw his plate against the wall, sending food and ceramic shards across the kitchen floor. "This is garbage," he screamed. "How many times do I have to tell you how to cook meat? Are you too stupid to follow simple instructions?" Elena immediately began cleaning up the mess, apologizing profusely, but Richard wasn't finished. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to her knees among the broken dishes. "You're going to clean this up with your bare hands," he said, "and then you're going to cook me something edible, or you're going to learn what real punishment feels like." As Elena knelt on the kitchen floor, picking up sharp pieces of ceramic, while Richard stood over her shouting abuse, something inside her finally snapped. She realized that this was never going to get better. Richard was never going to transform back into the charming man she had met in Mexico. This was who he really was, and if she stayed, he was eventually going to kill her. That night, after Richard had fallen asleep, Elena lay in her small bed and began to plan. She had no money, no identification, and no clear understanding of American geography beyond Chicago, but she had something more valuable than any of those things, the absolute certainty that she had to escape, no matter what the cost. The plan that formed in Elena's mind over the following days was born of desperation and the kind of clarity that comes only from facing a life-or-death situation. She began to pay closer attention to Richard's routines, his business associates, and most importantly, his weaknesses. Richard's drinking had become more pronounced, and Elena noticed that he was most vulnerable late at night when he would pass out in his recliner in front of the television. She also discovered that he kept important documents, including her passport, in a fireproof safe in his bedroom closet. Rather than running toward it, she had chosen a seat near the back, pulling her hood up and keeping her head down as the city lights faded into darkness behind them. The wedding dress was gone now, disposed of in a dumpster behind Union Station along with every other trace of the woman Richard Blackwood thought he owned. Elena had bought clothes from a thrift store near the bus terminal, jeans, a warm sweater, and a jacket that had seen better days but would keep her warm during the journey ahead. She had also purchased a baseball cap and cheap sunglasses, creating a disguise that was simple but effective. To anyone who might be looking for a frightened Mexican woman in a wedding dress, she was now just another anonymous traveler heading west. The bus route she had chosen would take her through Iowa, Nebraska, and finally into Montana. She had picked Montana almost randomly from the departure board, drawn by the idea of wide open spaces where a person could disappear completely. She had no specific destination in mind beyond getting as far from Chicago as possible, but something about the name Big Sky Country had appealed to her desperate need for freedom. During the long hours of travel, Eleanor reflected on the events that had brought her to this point. She thought about her family back in Guadalajara, her sister Maria, who was probably worried sick, and her mother, who might never understand why Elena had felt the need to vanish so completely. She had wanted to call them, to let them know she was safe, but she knew that any contact could potentially lead Richard back to her trail. The hardest part was not knowing if her plan had worked. By now, Richard would have returned home to find the staged scene in the bathroom. Would he believe that she had killed herself, or would he see through her deception? Elena tried not to think about what would happen if he realized she was still alive. She had seen enough of his capacity for violence to know that his pursuit would be relentless. As the bus rolled through the Iowa countryside, Elena struck up a tentative friendship with an elderly woman named Dorothy, who was traveling to visit her grandchildren in Denver. Dorothy was kind and talkative, and she seemed to sense that Elena needed someone to talk to without prying too deeply into her circumstances. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, honey," Dorothy said, as they shared a bag of crackers during a rest stop in Des Moines. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what a person needs. Elena found herself opening up to Dorothy more than she had intended. She didn't tell her the full truth, but she spoke about feeling trapped in a bad situation and needing to find a new beginning somewhere safe. Dorothy listened without judgment, offering quiet words of encouragement and the kind of maternal comfort that Elena hadn't experienced since leaving Mexico. "I have a feeling you're stronger than you know," Dorothy told her as they prepared to board the bus for the next leg of their journey. "Sometimes we don't discover our own strength until we're forced to use it." When Dorothy's stop came in Denver, Eleanor felt a pang of loneliness as she watched the older woman gather her belongings. But Dorothy pressed a small piece of paper into Elena's hand before departing. "This is my daughter's phone number," she said quietly. "She lives in Billings, Montana. If you ever need help or just someone to talk to, you call her and mention my name. Promise me," Elena promised, though she doubted she would ever make that call. She had learned to be wary of trusting anyone too completely. But as the bus continued north through Colorado and into Wyoming, she found herself holding onto the piece of paper like a talisman. The landscape changed dramatically as they traveled. Deeper into the mountain west, the flat prairies gave way to rolling hills, and then to the dramatic peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Elena pressed her face to the window, mesmerized by the vastness of the scenery. She had never seen a country like this, so wide and open and seemingly endless. For the first time since leaving Chicago, she began to feel like she might actually be able to disappear into this landscape. By the time the bus reached Montana, Elena had been traveling for nearly 3 days. She was exhausted, hungry, and running low on money, but she was also further from Richard Blackwood than she had ever imagined possible. The bus made stops in several small Montana towns, and Elena found herself studying each one, looking for some sign that would tell her where she should get off. It was in a town called Hawthorne Creek that Elena finally made her decision. The bus had stopped for a scheduled break, and as she stepped outside to stretch her legs, she was struck by the sight of the surrounding countryside. Rolling hills stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle and bordered by snow-capped mountains in the distance. The town itself was small, maybe 1,000 people at most, with a main street lined with businesses that looked like they had been there for decades. Something about Hawthorne Creek felt right to Elena. It was small enough that she could blend in, remote enough that Richard would never think to look for her there, and surrounded by enough open country that she could see anyone coming from miles away. When the bus driver called for passengers to reboard, Elena made a split-second decision that would change the course of her life. She stayed on the sidewalk as the bus pulled away, watching it disappear down the highway with a mixture of terror and relief. She was now completely on her own, in a place where she knew no one and had no plan beyond survival. Elena spent her first night in Hawthorne Creek in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The room was basic but clean, and for the first time in months, she was able to sleep without listening for Richard's footsteps in the hallway. She slept for 12 straight hours, her body finally allowing itself to rest now that she was thousands of miles away from immediate danger. The next morning, Elena began the process of figuring out how to build a new life from nothing. She had enough money to last maybe 2 weeks if she was careful. But she needed to find work quickly. She also needed to establish some kind of legal identity, which seemed like an impossible task given her circumstances. Her first stop was the local diner, where she hoped to find both a meal and information about job opportunities. The diner was exactly what she had expected. A small-town establishment with worn vinyl booths, a long counter, and the kind of atmosphere that suggested the same people had been eating there for years. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, greeted Elena with the sort of friendly curiosity that she was learning was typical of small-town Montana. "You're not from around here," the waitress observed, as she poured Elena a cup of coffee. "Just passing through, or are you planning to stick around?" "I'm not sure yet," Elena answered honestly. "I'm looking for work, actually. Do you know if anyone in town is hiring?" The waitress, whose name tag read Betty, considered this question while Elena studied the menu. "Well, harvest season is still a few months away, so most of the ranch work won't start until then," Betty said. "But I know Sarah Chen over at the grocery store has been looking for someone to help with inventory and stocking, and there's always housekeeping work if you're willing to do that kind of thing." Elena's heart sank slightly. She had been hoping to find something that would allow her to stay under the radar, but grocery stores and hotels would likely require documentation that she didn't have. Betty must have noticed her expression because she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Honey, I don't know what your situation is, and I'm not asking," she said gently. "But if you need work that pays cash and doesn't ask too many questions, there are plenty of ranchers around here who could use help with cleaning, cooking, or general maintenance. Some of them are more particular about paperwork than others, if you know what I mean." Elena nodded gratefully. This was exactly the kind of information she needed. "There's a bulletin board over there by the door," Betty continued, pointing to a corner of the diner. "People post all kinds of notices, job opportunities, rooms for rent, things for sale. You might find something useful." After finishing her breakfast, Elena spent several minutes studying the bulletin board. Most of the job postings were for seasonal ranch work or part-time positions in town, but one notice caught her attention. It was handwritten on plain white paper and simply read, "Housekeeper needed for elderly woman, room and board provided, cash payment, serious inquiries only, ask Betty for details." Elena approached Betty with the notice, and the waitress's expression grew thoughtful. "That would be for Mrs. Henderson," Betty explained. "She's in her 80s and lives alone, about 10 miles out of town. Her arthritis has been getting worse, and her family has been after her to get some help around the house. She's a sweet lady, but she's also pretty independent. She might be exactly what you're looking for." Betty provided Eleanor with directions to the Henderson Ranch and wished her luck. As Elena prepared to make the trek on foot, she had no car and couldn't afford to rent one. Betty called her back. "Take this," Betty said, handing Elena a paper bag. "It's just some sandwiches and fruit. Mrs. Henderson will probably offer you lunch, but it's a long walk out there." The kindness of this stranger brought tears to Elena's eyes. After months of living with Richard's cruelty, she had almost forgotten that people could be generous without expecting something in return. The walk to the Henderson Ranch took Elena nearly 3 hours, but she didn't mind. The exercise felt good after days of sitting on the bus, and the Montana countryside was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The air was clean and crisp, the sky was an impossible shade of blue, and the silence was broken only by the sound of wind through the grass and the occasional call of a bird. Mrs. Henderson's ranch house was a modest 2-story structure surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and a large vegetable garden. Elena could see cattle grazing in the distance and several horses in a nearby pasture. It was the kind of place that spoke of hard work and simple living, and Elena found herself hoping desperately that Mrs. Henderson would be willing to hire her. Her first meeting with Alice Henderson went better than Eleanor had dared to hope. Mrs. Henderson was indeed elderly, but she was also sharp, kind, and remarkably perceptive. She listened to Elena's carefully rehearsed story about being between jobs and looking for a fresh start, without pressing for details that Elena couldn't provide. "I don't need to know your whole life story," Mrs. Henderson said as they sat in her comfortable kitchen, sharing tea and homemade cookies. "I just need to know that you're honest, that you're willing to work hard, and that you won't steal from me or bring trouble to my door." Elena assured her that she met all of those criteria, and Mrs. Henderson seemed satisfied. "The work isn't glamorous," the older woman explained. "I need help with cleaning, cooking, laundry, and general maintenance around the house. The pay is $300 a week, cash plus room and board. You'd have your own space in the apartment above the garage, and you'd be welcome to eat meals with me or cook for yourself, whatever you prefer." It sounded like paradise to Elena, a safe place to live, honest work, and enough money to slowly build some kind of future. She accepted the position immediately. Elena's first few weeks at the Henderson Ranch were a period of healing and adjustment. Mrs. Henderson proved to be an ideal employer. Kind but not intrusive, appreciative of Elena's work but not demanding. The older woman seemed to understand instinctively that Elena needed space to recover from whatever trauma had brought her to Montana. The work was physically demanding but satisfying in a way that Elena had never experienced. She cleaned and organized the ranch house, tended to Mrs. Henderson's extensive vegetable garden, and helped with minor repairs around the property. For the first time in her life, she felt like her labor was valued and appreciated rather than taken for granted. Living in the apartment above the garage gave Elena the privacy she needed while still providing her with a sense of security. She could see the main house from her windows, and she knew that Mrs. Henderson was nearby if she needed help. But she also had her own space where she could process her experiences and begin to heal from the trauma of her months with Richard. Elena established a routine that helped her feel grounded and safe. She woke early each morning and spent time in the garden, finding peace in the simple act of tending to growing things. She prepared breakfast for herself, and Mrs. Henderson spent the day working around the property and evenings reading books from Mrs. Henderson's extensive library or watching old movies on the small television in her apartment. It was during one of these quiet evenings, about a month after she'd started working for Mrs. Henderson, that Eleanor's carefully constructed new life began to show its first cracks. She was reading in bed when she heard a car engine in the distance, followed by the sound of vehicles pulling into the ranch driveway. Elena's blood ran cold. Mrs. Henderson rarely had visitors after dark, and Elena's first thought was that somehow, impossibly, Richard had found her. She crept to the window and peered down at the driveway, her heart pounding. What she saw made her knees go weak with relief. It wasn't Richard's car, but rather a sheriff's department vehicle and what appeared to be a family sedan. As Elena watched, Mrs. Henderson emerged from the house to greet the visitors, and Elena could see from her body language that this was an expected, if not entirely welcome, encounter. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson explained the situation over breakfast. Her nephew, who lived in Billings, had been pressuring her to move to an assisted living facility. He had enlisted the help of a social worker to conduct a welfare check, arguing that an 83-year-old woman shouldn't be living alone on a remote ranch. "It's ridiculous, of course," Mrs. Henderson said with obvious frustration. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, especially now that I have your help. But Robert has been worried ever since his father died last year, and he thinks I'm too stubborn for my own good." Elena listened with growing alarm. If Mrs. Henderson's family succeeded in forcing her into assisted living, Elena would lose not only her job, but also the only safe haven she had found since leaving Chicago. "What did you tell them about me?" Elena asked carefully. Mrs. Henderson gave her a knowing look. "I told them that I had hired a housekeeper and that she was working out very well. I didn't provide any details about your background or your legal status, if that's what you're worried about." Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward the older woman, who had clearly understood more about Elena's situation than she had let on. "But, Elena," Mrs. Henderson continued gently, "they're going to be keeping a closer eye on things around here for a while. If there's anything about your situation that might cause problems, you should probably think about what you want to do." That night, Eleanor lay awake considering her options. She had been happier at the ranch than she had been anywhere else since leaving Mexico, but she knew that increased scrutiny from Mrs. Henderson's family could potentially expose her precarious legal situation. She had been hoping to save enough money to eventually hire a lawyer who could help her navigate the immigration system, but that process would take months or even years. As she wrestled with these concerns, Elena began to formulate a backup plan. She had noticed that the ranch property extended for several miles in each direction, with much of it consisting of unused pasture land and wooded areas. If she needed to disappear quickly, she could potentially survive in the wilderness for a short time while figuring out her next move. It was this backup plan that would ultimately save her life, though not in the way she had expected. Because 3 weeks later, on a cold night in early May, Elena would find herself running through the Montana darkness once again, this time with the sound of Richard Blackwood's voice echoing behind her. But that night was still in the future. For now, Elena was safe in her small apartment above the garage, listening to the wind through the cottonwood trees and planning for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had survived the worst period of her life and built something resembling a normal existence. She was stronger than she had been when she left Chicago, more confident in her ability to take care of herself. What Elena didn't know was that her carefully constructed new identity was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined, and that her next chapter would bring her face to face with a man whose kindness would challenge everything she thought she knew about trust, safety, and the possibility of genuine love. Marcus Riley had always been a man of routines. At 34, he had settled into a life that revolved around the predictable rhythms of ranch work, the changing seasons, and the comfortable solitude of his property 15 miles outside Hawthorne Creek. He woke at 5:30 every morning, fed his horses and cattle, checked the fence lines, and spent his evenings reading or working on small repair projects around his modest ranch house. His neighbors often wondered why such an eligible bachelor chose to live alone on his inherited family ranch. But Marcus preferred it that way. He had tried the social scene in town for a few years after returning from his stint in the army, but he found most people's need for constant conversation exhausting. The ranch offered him everything he needed: honest work, the company of his animals, and the vast Montana sky that never failed to remind him how small human problems really were in the grand scheme of things. Marcus had inherited the property from his grandfather 3 years earlier, along with a modest herd of cattle and 2 aging horses named Thunder and Bell. The ranch wasn't large by Montana standards, just 800 acres of rolling pasture and woodland, but it was enough to support a simple lifestyle and provide Marcus with the independence he craved. He had grown up on this land, spending summers with his grandparents while his parents worked their own ranch closer to Billings. When his grandfather died and left him the property, Marcus had seen it as an opportunity to create the kind of life he wanted: uncomplicated, self-sufficient, and peaceful. That peace was shattered on a Tuesday morning in mid-May, when Marcus discovered that someone had been living in his tool shed. He had noticed small signs over the previous few days. A water spigot left slightly open, some missing canned goods from his emergency supplies, footprints in the soft earth around his vegetable garden that were definitely not his own. At first, he had assumed it was probably a drifter passing through, maybe someone who had taken shelter for a night and moved on. But as he approached the shed that morning, coffee mug in hand and Belle following behind him hoping for apple treats, Marcus realized that whoever had been on his property was still there. The woman he found sleeping in his shed was not what he had expected. She was small and slight, with dark hair that looked like it hadn't been properly washed in weeks. She was wearing men's work clothes that were too large for her frame, and she was curled up on a pile of horse blankets he kept stored for emergencies. What struck Marcus most was how young she looked, probably mid-20s, and how exhausted she appeared even in sleep. His first instinct was to wake her up and demand an explanation, but something about her vulnerable position made him hesitate. There was something about the way she was sleeping, one arm thrown protectively over her face, her body curled into a defensive position that suggested she was running from something rather than looking for trouble. Marcus stepped back from the shed and considered his options. He could call the sheriff and have her removed as a trespasser, but that seemed harsh, given that she obviously wasn't trying to steal anything valuable. She could simply be a harmless drifter who needed a safe place to rest. On the other hand, he didn't know anything about her situation, and inviting strangers onto isolated property could be dangerous. While he was debating what to do, the decision was made for him. Belle, who had been patiently waiting for her morning treat, chose that moment to nicker softly. The sound was enough to wake the woman in the shed, and Marcus found himself looking into the most frightened eyes he had ever seen. Elena's first conscious thought when she woke up was that she had been discovered, and her brief period of safety was over. The man standing outside the shed was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair and weathered hands that suggested he worked outdoors for a living. He was holding a coffee mug and appeared to be studying her with more curiosity than anger, but Elena's months of living in fear had taught her not to trust initial appearances. She scrambled to her feet, immediately putting her hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice hoarse from sleep and dehydration. "I didn't mean any harm. I can leave right now. I just needed somewhere to sleep for a few nights." Marcus noticed her slight accent and the way she seemed to be preparing to run at the first sign of aggression from him. Whatever had brought this woman to his property, it was clear that she was genuinely afraid. "Easy," he said, using the same calm tone he used with spooked horses. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I do need to know who you are and what you're doing on my land." Elena studied his face, looking for signs of the anger or violence she had learned to recognize. But this man's expression was cautious rather than threatening, and his body language suggested concern rather than hostility. "My name is Elena," she said carefully, deciding that the truth was probably her best option in this situation. "I've been staying here for a few days. I didn't think anyone would notice." "Elena," Marcus repeated as if testing the name. "I'm Marcus Riley. This is my ranch. And trust me, I notice everything that happens on my property." The mention of his name triggered a memory in Elena's mind. She had heard that name before, during her conversations with Betty at the diner in town. Marcus Riley was one of the local ranchers Betty had mentioned as someone who might be willing to hire help without asking too many questions about documentation. "You're Marcus Riley," Elena said, her fear beginning to mix with cautious hope. "Betty at the diner mentioned you. She said you sometimes hire people for ranch work." Marcus raised an eyebrow. This woman had been asking about work in town, which suggested she wasn't just a random drifter. It also explained how she might have known about his property. "Betty talks too much for her own good," Marcus said, though there was no real irritation in his voice. But she's not wrong. I do hire help sometimes during busy seasons, though I usually prefer to meet potential employees under normal circumstances, not find them sleeping in my shed. Despite everything, Elena felt a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth. There was something almost absurd about the situation, and Marcus Riley's dry sense of humor was a welcome change from the hostility she had been expecting. "I understand this looks bad," Elena said, "but I promise I'm not here to cause trouble. I just needed a safe place to stay for a while." Something in her tone when she said safe place caught Marcus's attention. He had spent enough time around damaged animals to recognize when a creature had been hurt and was seeking shelter. "Safe from what?" he asked gently. Elena hesitated. She had spent weeks perfecting a story that would explain her presence without revealing too much about her past, but something about Marcus Riley's straightforward manner made her want to tell him the truth. "Someone who hurt me," she said finally. "Someone I had to get away from." Marcus nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. He had known other people who had needed to disappear for similar reasons, and he understood the desperation that could drive someone to seek refuge in a stranger's shed. "Are you in immediate danger?" he asked. "Do I need to call the sheriff?" "No," Elena said quickly, then paused to consider whether that was actually true. "I mean, I don't think so. I've been careful. I don't think anyone knows where I am." Marcus studied her for a long moment, taking in her obvious exhaustion, her too large clothes, and the way she kept glancing around as if expecting trouble to appear at any moment. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" he asked. The question surprised Elena. She had been prepared for accusations, demands for explanation, or orders to leave his property. She hadn't expected kindness. "I've been eating," she said evasively. "That's not what I asked." "When's the last time you had a hot meal that didn't come from a can or a vending machine?" Eleanor tried to remember. She had been living off the supplies she had managed to take from Mrs. Henderson's pantry before she fled, supplemented by occasional purchases from a gas station on the highway. It had been more than a week since she had eaten anything that could be considered a proper meal. "A while," she admitted. Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them realized it at the time. "Come up to the house," he said. "I'll make breakfast, and we can figure out what to do next." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "You're inviting me into your house? You don't even know me." "I know you're hungry, tired, and scared," Marcus replied. "That's enough for now." As they walked toward the ranch house, Belle trailing behind them hopefully, Elena tried to process this unexpected turn of events. 3 days earlier, she had been forced to flee the Henderson ranch in the middle of the night when she spotted a car that looked too much like Richard's parked outside the main house. She had grabbed what supplies she could carry and disappeared into the Montana wilderness, following game trails and back roads until she found Marcus's property. She had chosen his shed because it was far enough from the main house that she thought she could shelter there undetected for a few days while figuring out her next move. She had planned to move on before anyone noticed her presence, but exhaustion and hunger had made her careless. Now she found herself following a stranger toward his house, uncertain whether she was making a terrible mistake or finally catching a break. Marcus's ranch house was modest but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and large windows that looked out over the surrounding pastures. The interior was Spartan but comfortable, decorated with simple furniture and a few family photographs that suggested multiple generations of Rileys had lived on this land. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the house, with a large wooden table, modern appliances, and evidence of regular cooking. Marcus gestured for Elena to sit at the table while he began preparing what looked like a substantial breakfast. "Coffee?" he asked, already reaching for a mug. Elena nodded gratefully. She couldn't remember the last time someone had offered to take care of her basic needs without expecting something in return. As Marcus cooked, he asked casual questions about her situation. He didn't press for details when she was evasive, but he gathered enough information to understand that she was alone, without resources, and probably running from some kind of domestic violence situation. "The way I see it," Marcus said as he set a plate of eggs, bacon and toast in front of her, "you have a few options. You can keep running, which doesn't seem to be working out too well for you. You can go back to whatever situation you're running from, which I'm guessing isn't really an option. Or you can stay here for a while and help me with ranch work until you figure out your next move." Elena looked up from her plate, certain she had misheard him. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a temporary solution," Marcus corrected. "I do need help around here, especially with the spring work coming up. You can stay in the guest room in the house, or I can set up a more permanent arrangement in the shed if you prefer your privacy. Either way, you'd have a safe place to stay and some income while you get back on your feet." "Why would you do that?" "For a stranger?" Eleanor asked. "You don't know anything about me." Marcus considered the question while he prepared his own plate. "My grandfather used to say that sometimes people show up in your life when you need them, and sometimes you show up in theirs when they need you. Maybe this is one of those times." It was such a simple explanation, but it resonated with Elena in a way that surprised her. For months, she had been surrounded by people who wanted to use her, control her, or hurt her. The idea that someone might help her simply because she needed help was almost too good to believe. "What kind of work?" she asked cautiously. "General ranch maintenance, mostly. Feeding animals, mending fences, helping with the vegetable garden. Some housekeeping if you're willing, though I can handle most of that myself. Nothing too complicated, but it's honest work and it pays fairly." Elena thought about her options. She had less than $50 left from the money she had taken from Richard's safe, and winter in Montana was still months away. She needed time to heal, to plan, and to figure out how to build a sustainable life for herself. "I should probably tell you that my situation is complicated," she said carefully. "There might be legal issues with hiring me." Marcus shrugged. "I've hired people with complicated situations before. As long as you're honest with me about anything that might put either of us in danger, I can work around the rest. And if someone comes looking for me, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Elena?" Marcus waited until she met his eyes. "If someone does show up here looking to hurt you, they're going to find out that I don't take kindly to people who abuse women." There was something in his tone that reminded Elena of her father, a quiet strength that suggested Marcus Riley was not a man to be intimidated easily. For the first time in months, Elena felt like she might have found someone who could actually protect her if necessary. "I accept," she said quietly, "but I want to earn my keep. I don't want charity." "Wouldn't dream of offering it," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "Trust me, if you're going to work for me, you'll earn every penny." That afternoon, Marcus showed Elena around the property, explaining the daily routines and introducing her to the animals. She was immediately drawn to Belle, the older mare who seemed to sense that Elena needed gentleness. Thunder, the gelding, was more standoffish but clearly well cared for. Elena found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks as they walked the fence lines, and Marcus pointed out various landmarks on his property. There was something deeply peaceful about the vastness of the Montana landscape, and something reassuring about Marcus's calm, competent presence. That evening, as Elena settled into the small but comfortable guest room Marcus had prepared for her, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, finally, she had found a place where she could be safe. She didn't know anything about Marcus Riley beyond what she had observed that day, but her instincts told her that he was genuinely trying to help her. What Elena didn't know was that her arrival on Marcus's ranch had been observed by someone else. 3 miles away, in a rented car parked on a rural road with a clear view of the Riley property, Richard Blackwood sat with a pair of binoculars and a satisfied smile. He had been tracking Elena for weeks, following a trail of small clues, and careful investigation that had eventually led him to Montana. The staged suicide scene in Chicago had fooled the police, but Richard knew Elena too well to believe she would actually kill herself. She was too stubborn, too determined to survive. Finding her had become an obsession for Richard, driven partly by rage at her deception and partly by his twisted sense of ownership. Elena belonged to him, and he would not tolerate her attempt to escape that reality. As he watched Elena and Marcus walking around the ranch, Richard began planning his next move. He would wait until he was certain of the situation, until he understood the layout of the property and the habits of its occupants. And then he would take back what was his, regardless of who tried to stop him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Elena had learned about survival, and everything Marcus believed about protecting the people who mattered to him. Elena had been living and working on Marcus's ranch for 3 weeks when she finally began to believe that she might actually be safe. The work was harder than anything she had done at Mrs. Henderson's place, but it was also more satisfying. Marcus treated her as an equal partner in the daily operations of the ranch, asking for her opinions on everything from which fence sections needed repair to how to improve the layout of the vegetable garden. The physical demands of ranch life were helping Elena regain the strength and confidence that months of abuse had stripped away. Her hands grew calloused from handling tools and feed, her muscles strengthened from lifting hay bales and wrestling with stubborn cattle, and the Montana sun gave her skin a healthy glow that replaced the pale, frightened look she had carried. Since Chicago, more importantly, Elena was learning to trust again. Marcus's consistent kindness and respect had gradually worn down the walls she had built around herself. He never asked intrusive questions about her past, never made demands that felt unreasonable, and never raised his voice, even when frustrated with something unrelated to her work. Their daily routines had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Elena woke early to help with the morning feeding, spent her days working on various projects around the ranch, and her evenings reading in the main house or helping Marcus prepare dinner. They had developed an easy companionship that felt natural and unforced. Elena particularly looked forward to their evening conversations over dinner. Marcus was well-read and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that often caught her off guard. He told her stories about growing up on the ranch, his time in the army, and his grandfather's philosophy about hard work and treating the land with respect. In return, Elena found herself sharing carefully edited versions of her own experiences. Stories about her family in Mexico, her dreams of building a different kind of life, and her growing appreciation for the vastness and beauty of Montana. It was during one of these conversations that Elena made a confession that surprised them both. "I think I understand now why you choose to live out here," she said, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "In the city, you're always surrounded by other people's noise and chaos. But here, you can actually hear yourself think." Marcus smiled. "My grandfather used to say that the land teaches you things you can't learn anywhere else. Patience, mostly, and perspective." "What do you mean?" "When you're dealing with weather and animals and seasons that don't care about your schedule or your problems, you learn that most of the things people worry about aren't really worth worrying about. The land has been here for thousands of years, and it'll be here long after we're gone." "That's humbling." Elena nodded, understanding what he meant in a way she couldn't have before coming to the ranch. "In Chicago, I felt like I was always running just to stay in the same place. Here, I feel like I'm actually building something." The moment felt significant to both of them, though neither was quite ready to examine why. There was something growing between them that went beyond employer and employee, beyond helper and person being helped. But Elena's past made her cautious about trusting those feelings, and Marcus's natural reserve made him hesitant to complicate their working relationship. It was Belle, the old mare, who first sensed that something was wrong. Elena was feeding the horses on a Thursday morning in early June when she noticed Belle's unusual behavior. The normally calm horse was restless, ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring as if she had caught an unfamiliar scent. Thunder was exhibiting similar signs of nervousness, pacing in his stall and nickering softly. Elena tried to soothe the animals, but their agitation only increased. She was beginning to wonder if there might be a predator in the area when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. A car engine coming up the long gravel driveway that led to the ranch house. Marcus rarely had visitors, and he had mentioned the night before that he wasn't expecting anyone. Elena's first instinct was to assume it was a neighbor, or perhaps someone from town with ranch business, but something about the horse's behavior made her move cautiously toward the barn door to get a look at the approaching vehicle. The car was a dark sedan with Illinois license plates, and even from a distance, Elena could see that the driver was a man traveling alone. Her heart began to race as terrible possibilities flooded her mind, but she told herself to stay calm. There were millions of dark sedans in the world, and plenty of reasons why someone from Illinois might have business in Montana. But when the car pulled to a stop in front of the ranch house and the driver stepped out, Elena's worst fears were confirmed. Richard Blackwood had found her. He looked different than she remembered, thinner, with new lines around his eyes, and a beard that suggested he hadn't been taking care of himself. But there was no mistaking the cold determination in his posture, or the way his gaze immediately began scanning the property as if he owned it. Elena pressed herself against the inside wall of the barn, her mind racing through options. The barn was too far from the house for her to warn Marcus, and she couldn't get to the main road without crossing open ground that would leave her visible to Richard. Her only choice was to hide and hope that Marcus would handle the situation. But even as she formed this plan, Elena knew it was hopeless. Richard hadn't tracked her across half the country just to be turned away by a stranger's denials. He would search every building on the property if necessary, and the barn would be one of the first places he looked. Marcus had been working in his office when he heard the car in the driveway. He glanced out the window and frowned at the sight of the unfamiliar vehicle. The man getting out of the car had an urban look that immediately marked him as someone who didn't belong in rural Montana, and there was something about his demeanor that set Marcus on edge. Marcus's military training had taught him to assess potential threats quickly, and everything about this visitor suggested trouble. The man was scanning the property with the systematic attention of someone conducting surveillance. His clothes were expensive but wrinkled, as if he had been traveling for a long time without much regard for his appearance. Most telling of all, he had the restless energy of someone operating on anger and adrenaline. By the time Marcus reached the front door, he had already decided that this visitor was connected to Elena's past and that the conversation was unlikely to be pleasant. Richard was standing near his car, hands on his hips, when Marcus stepped onto the porch. At close range, Marcus could see that the man was probably in his early 40s, well-built but soft around the edges, in a way that suggested he spent more time behind a desk than doing physical work. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice neutral, but positioning himself so that he could move quickly if necessary. Richard's smile was cold and calculating. "I hope so. I'm looking for my wife. I have reason to believe she might be staying here." "I think you might be confused," Marcus replied. "I live alone." "Robert Blackwood," Richard said, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed friendly but felt like a threat. "And you would be?" Marcus didn't take the offered hand. "Marcus Riley. This is my property." Richard's smile widened, but his eyes remained hard. "Nice place you have here, Marcus. Very isolated, the kind of place where someone might think they could disappear. If you're looking for someone specific, you might want to try the sheriff's office in town, Marcus suggested. They keep track of missing persons reports. Oh, she's not exactly missing, Richard said with a laugh that made Marcus's skin crawl. She's just confused. You see, my wife Elena has been having some mental health issues lately. Delusions, paranoia, that sort of thing. Her doctors think she might have hurt herself, but I know better. I know she's just scared and looking for somewhere to hide. Marcus felt a surge of anger at the casual way Richard dismissed Elena's mental state, but he kept his expression neutral. I'm sorry to hear about your wife's troubles, but I can't help you. There's no one here by that name. Richard's facade of politeness began to slip. Look, I know she's here. I've been watching your property for days. I've seen her working around the ranch, taking care of your animals. I'm not leaving without her. The admission that Richard had been conducting surveillance made Marcus's blood run cold. This man had been stalking Elena, learning their routines, planning his approach. Marcus realized that Elena was probably in immediate danger. Even if what you're saying were true, Marcus said carefully, I couldn't force someone to go with you against their will. That would be kidnapping. Richard laughed again, a sound devoid of humor. Kidnapping. She's my wife. I'm trying to get her the help she needs. Besides, she's not exactly here legally, is she? I'm sure the immigration authorities would be very interested to know about the Mexican woman working on your ranch without proper documentation. The threat was clear, and Marcus understood that Richard had done his homework. He knew enough about Elena's situation to cause serious problems for both of them if he chose to involve federal authorities. But Marcus also recognized something else in Richard's demeanor. The self-righteous anger of an abuser who genuinely believed he was entitled to control another person's life. Marcus had encountered men like this during his military service, usually in domestic violence situations on base. They were dangerous because they saw their victims as property rather than people. I think you should leave, Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning that Richard either didn't hear or chose to ignore. I'm not going anywhere without Elena, Richard replied. You can make this easy or you can make it hard, but either way, I'm taking my wife home. At that moment, Elena made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. She had been listening to the conversation from inside the barn, and she could hear the escalating tension in both men's voices. She knew that Marcus was trying to protect her, but she also knew that Richard was capable of violence when he didn't get his way. Elena couldn't bear the thought of Marcus getting hurt because of her problems. She took a deep breath, stepped out of the barn, and walked across the yard toward the two men. Hello, Richard, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard's expression transformed into something resembling relief, though Elena could see the fury burning beneath the surface. Elena, sweetheart, you've had me so worried. Are you all right? Have you been taking your medication? Marcus looked at Elena with confusion and concern. The woman approaching them bore little resemblance to the frightened person he had found. In his shed 3 weeks earlier, this Elena walked with purpose and spoke with quiet dignity, even in the face of obvious danger. I'm not sick, Richard, Elena said calmly, and I'm not going back to Chicago with you. Richard's mask of concern slipped entirely. Yes, you are. You're my wife, and you're coming home where you belong. I was never your wife, Elena replied. We were never legally married. You brought me to America under false pretenses and then held me prisoner in your house. Marcus was beginning to understand the true nature of Elena's situation, and his anger toward Richard was growing stronger by the moment. But he also recognized that Elena was handling the confrontation with remarkable composure, and he decided to let her take the lead while staying ready to intervene if necessary. Richard's face was turning red with anger. You signed papers. You agreed to marry me. You took my money. I signed papers for a marriage that never happened, Elena said. You paid a bride agency, not me. And taking someone's passport and threatening their family isn't marriage, it's human trafficking. The legal implications of Elena's words seemed to penetrate Richard's rage because his expression became more calculating. That's a very serious accusation, Elena. Do you have any proof of these claims? Because I have documentation showing that you entered the country as my fiancée and have been living in my house as my common-law wife. Elena felt a chill as she realized that Richard had probably prepared for this confrontation legally as well as physically. He would have paperwork that supported his version of events, while she had nothing but her word. But Marcus stepped forward, and his presence reminded Elena that she wasn't facing this alone. "The lady has made her position clear," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "She doesn't want to go with you, and she's on my property by invitation. That makes you the trespasser here." Richard turned his attention to Marcus, and Elena could see him sizing up this new obstacle. Richard was used to intimidating people through wealth and legal threats, but Marcus represented a different kind of challenge, someone who wasn't easily intimidated and who clearly had no intention of backing down. "This isn't your business," Richard said, but there was less confidence in his voice than before. "When someone threatens a person under my protection, it becomes my business," Marcus replied. The word protection seemed to infuriate Richard beyond reason. The idea that another man would claim the right to protect what he considered his property struck at the core of his twisted sense of ownership. "Your protection?" Richard snarled. "You don't even know what she is. She's a liar and a thief. She stole money from me and faked her own death to avoid her responsibilities." Elena felt the familiar shame and fear that Richard's accusations always triggered, but this time something was different. Marcus's steady presence beside her and the knowledge that she had built something genuine over the past few weeks gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I took money that was supposed to go to my family," Eleanor said. "Money you never sent despite your promises, and I didn't fake my death to avoid responsibilities. I did it to escape someone who was going to kill me." The words hung in the air, between them raw and honest in a way that made Richard's manipulations seem petty and small by comparison. Richard's response was swift and vicious. "You ungrateful little—" But he never finished the sentence. Marcus moved faster than Elena had ever seen anyone move, covering the distance between them and grabbing Richard by the front of his shirt before the other man could complete his insult. "I think it's time for you to leave," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet. "And if I see you on my property again, or if I hear that you've contacted Elena in any way, you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation." Richard struggled against Marcus's grip, but it was clear that he was outmatched physically. "You can't threaten me," he gasped. "I'll call the police. I'll have you arrested." "Go ahead," Marcus replied, releasing him with enough force to send Richard stumbling backward. "I'm sure they'd be very interested to hear about your human trafficking operation." Richard straightened his clothes and tried to regain his composure, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He had come to Montana expecting to intimidate Elena and whoever was helping her, but he had encountered something he wasn't prepared for, a man who wasn't afraid of him and who clearly had the means and willingness to protect Elena. "This isn't over," Richard said, backing toward his car. "She's still my responsibility, and I have legal rights." "Your rights end where her safety begins," Marcus replied. "And Richard? If anything happens to Elena or her family back in Mexico, I'm going to assume you're responsible. I hope I'm making myself clear." Richard got into his car without another word, but the look he gave Elena as he drove away was full of promise and threat. He might be retreating for now, but this confrontation had only strengthened his determination to reclaim what he saw as his property. As the sound of Richard's car faded into the distance, Elena felt her legs give out beneath her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was dissipating, leaving her shaky and exhausted. Marcus caught her before she could fall, his strong arms providing the support she needed, both physically and emotionally. "It's okay," he said gently. "He's gone. You're safe." But even as Marcus spoke the words, both of them knew that Richard's departure was only temporary. He had found Eleanor once, and he would undoubtedly try again. The question was not whether he would return, but when, and what they would do when he did. The hours following Richard's departure were filled with a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the ranch. Marcus insisted on checking every building, every fence line, and every possible hiding place, where someone might attempt to approach the property undetected. Elena found herself jumping at every sound, the creak of settling wood, the rustle of wind through the grass, even Belle's gentle nickering in the pasture. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for, Marcus finally addressed the elephant in the room. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "That man isn't going to give up. He's going to come back, probably with a different approach." Elena nodded, having come to the same conclusion. "I know. And I can't ask you to keep protecting me. This isn't your fight." Marcus's response was immediate and firm. "Like hell it isn't. The moment he stepped onto my property and threatened you, it became my fight. Marcus, you don't understand what he's capable of. He has money, connections, legal resources that we don't have. He could make life very difficult for you." "Let me worry about that," Marcus replied. "The question is, what do you want to do? Because we have options." Elena looked at him with surprise. In her experience, when powerful men like Richard decided they wanted something, ordinary people like her had very few options indeed. What kind of options? Marcus had spent the afternoon thinking about exactly this question. "We could contact the authorities, report him for stalking and harassment. We could hire a lawyer to help you sort out your immigration status and get legal protection, or—" he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "We could make sure he never has a legal claim on you." "What do you mean?" "Marriage," Marcus said simply. "If you marry an American citizen, it changes your legal status and gives you protections you don't currently have. It would also eliminate any claim he might have based on your previous relationship." Elena stared at him in shock. Are you proposing to me?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm offering you a solution, a legal arrangement that would protect you and give you a path to citizenship. It doesn't have to be— it could be just on paper if that's what you want." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Elena didn't know how to respond. After months of being treated as property, the idea that someone would offer to share their legal protections with her was almost incomprehensible. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he finally looked up, there was something vulnerable in his expression that Elena had never seen before. "Because I care about what happens to you," he said. "Because you've become important to me in a way that has nothing to do with ranch work or temporary arrangements. And because the thought of that man taking you away from here makes me want to do something that would probably land me in prison." Elena felt her heart skip at his words, but she also felt the familiar fear that came with trusting someone completely. "Marcus, I can't ask you to marry me just to solve my problems. That's not fair to you. You're not asking. I'm offering. And, Elena, it wouldn't just be about solving your problems. These past few weeks they've been the best I've had in a long time. Having you here, working together, talking together, it feels right in a way that nothing else has." Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his feelings were genuine and not just born out of a desire to protect her. But her experience with Richard had taught her to be wary of men who claimed to have her best interests at heart. "What If you change your mind, she asked, what if you wake up one day and decide you don't want to be tied to someone with my kind of baggage? Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. Elena, I've been alone on this ranch for 3 years. I've had plenty of time to think about what I want in life, and I've had plenty of opportunities to find someone if I wanted to. I'm not offering this because I feel sorry for you or because I'm lonely. I'm offering it because I think we could build something good together. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, trying to process the enormity of what he was suggesting. It would be a real marriage, not just a legal arrangement. That would be up to you, Marcus said. We could take it as slow as you need to, but yes, if you wanted it to be real, I would want that too. Before Elena could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching the house. Both of them tensed, and Marcus immediately moved to the window to look outside. It's Sheriff Davidson, Marcus said, relief evident in his voice. But he's not alone. Eleanor joined him at the window and saw a sheriff's department SUV parked in the driveway, along with another official-looking vehicle she didn't recognize. 2 men in uniforms were walking toward the house, and Elena could see a third person waiting by the cars. Marcus opened the door before the officers could knock, greeting the sheriff with a nod of recognition. "Evening, Marcus," Sheriff Davidson said. He was a man in his 50s with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested decades of dealing with every kind of trouble Montana could produce. "Sorry to bother you so late, but we need to have a conversation." "What about?" "About a complaint we received this afternoon from a man named Richard Blackwood. He's claiming that you're harboring his wife against her will and that she may be in the country illegally." Elena felt her heart sink. Richard had wasted no time in involving the authorities, just as he had threatened to do. His wife? Marcus asked, "Sheriff, I'd like you to meet Elena Vasquez. Ms. Vasquez, this is Sheriff Davidson." Elena stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. "Sheriff." Davidson studied her with the careful attention of someone trained to read people. "Ms. Vasquez, are you here of your own free will?" "Yes, sir." "I am." "And are you married to Richard Blackwood?" Elena took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, and she knew that her answer would determine the course of everything that followed. "No, sir. I was brought to America under the pretense of marrying Mr. Blackwood, but no legal marriage ever took place. He held me against my will in his house in Chicago for several months before I was able to escape." The second officer, who had been taking notes, looked up with interest. "That's a very serious allegation, ma'am. Human trafficking is a federal crime." "I understand that," Eleanor replied. "And I'm willing to cooperate with any investigation you want to conduct." Sheriff Davidson exchanged a look with his colleague. "The thing is, Ms. Vasquez, Mr. Blackwood has documentation that seems to support his version of events. Immigration records, correspondence between you, even financial records showing that he supported you and your family." Elena's heart sank further. She had suspected that Richard would have prepared for this possibility, but hearing it confirmed was still devastating. "Sheriff," Marcus interjected, "I don't know what kind of paperwork this man has, but I can tell you that Elena came to my property frightened, exhausted, and obviously running from someone who had hurt her. That's not the behavior of someone trying to avoid their legal obligations." "Mr. Blackwood mentioned that his wife has been having mental health issues," the second officer said. "Paranoia, delusions, that sort of thing. He says she's convinced herself that he was abusing her when he was actually trying to get her help." Elena felt a familiar rage building in her chest. Even from a distance, Richard was still managing to manipulate the narrative, to make her look like the unstable one, while positioning himself as the concerned husband. "Officer," Elena said, working to keep her voice level, "I would be happy to undergo any psychiatric evaluation you think is necessary. I would also be happy to show you the scars from the abuse I suffered at Mr. Blackwood's hands." This offer seemed to surprise both officers. People suffering from delusions typically didn't offer to provide physical evidence of their claims. "That won't be necessary right now," Sheriff Davidson said. "But we do need to sort this situation out. Mr. Blackwood is threatening to involve federal immigration authorities if we don't resolve this tonight." "What exactly is he asking for?" Marcus asked. "He wants Ms. Vasquez to return to Chicago with him voluntarily. He says if she does that, he won't press charges for theft or file immigration complaints." Elena felt the trap closing around her. Richard was offering her a choice between returning to captivity or facing federal prosecution and deportation. Either way, she would lose everything she had built in Montana. But before she could respond, Marcus spoke up. "Sheriff, what if Ms. Vasquez's immigration status weren't an issue? What if she had legal standing to remain in the country?" Davidson raised an eyebrow. "What are you getting at, Marcus?" Marcus turned to Elena, his expression serious but supportive. "Elena, my offer from earlier, does it still stand?" Elena understood immediately what he was asking. In front of the sheriff and a federal officer, Marcus was asking if she wanted to accept his proposal of marriage. It would solve her immediate legal problems, but it would also mean committing to a life she still wasn't sure she was ready for. But as she looked at Marcus's face, Elena saw something that made her decision easier. There was no pressure in his expression. No demand that she accept his offer. He was simply giving her the option, making it clear that the choice was entirely hers. "Yes," Elena said quietly. "It does." Marcus turned back to the sheriff. "Sheriff Davidson, I'd like to ask Ms. Vasquez to marry me. If she accepts, that would change her legal status significantly." The federal officer looked skeptical. "Marriage for immigration purposes is also a federal crime if it's fraudulent." "There's nothing fraudulent about it," Marcus replied firmly. "Elena has been living and working on my ranch for weeks. We've gotten to know each other, and I care about her. The timing might be influenced by current circumstances, but the feelings are real." Elena stepped closer to Marcus, taking his hand in a gesture that she hoped would demonstrate to the officers that this wasn't just a legal convenience. "I accept," she said, looking into Marcus's eyes. "I would be honored to marry you." Sheriff Davidson looked between them with the expression of someone who had seen too much to be easily fooled, but who also understood the complexities of human relationships. "Well," he said finally, "that does complicate things. If you two are planning to get married, then Ms. Vasquez would have legal grounds to remain in the country pending the processing of her immigration status." "How quickly can we make this official?" Marcus asked. "Montana has a waiting period for marriage licenses," Davidson replied. "But given the circumstances, I think I could make some calls and expedite the process. You could probably be married within 48 hours. If you're serious about this." Elena felt a mixture of relief and terror at the speed with which her life was changing. 48 hours earlier, she had been an undocumented refugee hiding on a remote ranch. Now she was agreeing to marry a man she had known for less than a month in order to escape another man who claimed to own her. "What about Richard?" she asked. "What happens when he finds out?" "Well, he can't force a married woman to return to him if she doesn't want to go," the federal officer said. "And if your allegations about human trafficking are true, we'd need to investigate those claims, regardless of your current marital status." Sheriff Davidson nodded in agreement. "Mr. Blackwood is staying at the motel in town. I'll go have another conversation with him, explain the new situation. In the meantime, you two should probably start making arrangements for this wedding." After the officers left, Elena and Marcus found themselves alone again, but everything felt different now. They were no longer just a rancher and his employee, or even two people who cared about each other. They were about to become husband and wife, bound together by law and by the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just committed to. Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her gently but securely. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Elena, I know this is happening fast, and I know the circumstances aren't ideal, but I meant what I said earlier. I care about you, and I want to build a life with you." Elena allowed herself to relax into his embrace, feeling safer than she had since childhood. "I care about you too, and I want to try to make this work. But Marcus, what if I'm not ready to be a real wife? What if I'm too damaged from what Richard did to me?" "Then we'll take it one day at a time," Marcus replied. "We'll go as slow as you need to go. The important thing is that you're safe and that we're together." As they stood there in the kitchen, holding each other and planning a wedding that neither of them had expected 48 hours earlier, Eleanor began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found the home and the love she had been searching for all her life. But outside in the darkness, Richard Blackwood sat in his motel room, staring at the phone number for a private investigator he had used in Chicago. Sheriff Davidson's visit had not gone the way he had planned, and the news that Elena was planning to marry another man had sent him into a rage that was both familiar and dangerous. Richard had not come this far and invested this much energy in reclaiming his property, only to be defeated by a small-town sheriff and a rancher with delusions of heroism. If legal channels wouldn't work, he would find other ways to get what belonged to him. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would test everything Eleanor and Marcus believed about love, commitment, and the lengths people would go to protect what mattered most to them. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sheriff Davidson called Marcus before dawn to inform him that Richard Blackwood had checked out of his motel during the night and disappeared. His rental car had been found abandoned at the Billings airport, but there was no record of him boarding any flights. He could be anywhere, Davidson warned. Maybe he gave up and went home. Maybe he's planning something else. Either way, you two need to be extra careful until we know for sure. Marcus relayed this information to Elena as they worked together to reinforce the ranch's security. They installed motion sensor lights around the main buildings, checked the locks on doors and windows, and established a system of signals they could use to communicate if they were separated and in danger. Despite these precautions, Eleanor found herself looking forward to their wedding with an excitement that surprised her. What had started as a legal necessity was beginning to feel like something she genuinely wanted. The more time she spent with Marcus, the more she appreciated his quiet strength, his dry humor, and his unwavering commitment to her safety and happiness. The wedding itself was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the courthouse in town. Sheriff Davidson had pulled strings to expedite the marriage license, and Betty from the diner had volunteered to serve as a witness along with Marcus's neighbor, Tom Patterson. Elena had found a simple white dress at a thrift store in town, nothing like the elaborate wedding she had once dreamed of, but perfect for the life she was actually building. Thursday evening, as Elena pressed the dress and Marcus polished his one good pair of dress shoes, they talked about their hopes for the future with a frankness that would have been impossible when they first met. "I've been thinking about what comes after," Marcus said, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "After we're married, after this whole situation with Richard is resolved, what do you want your life to look like?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. A month ago, her only goal had been survival. Now she was being asked to envision a future that included happiness, fulfillment, and genuine choice. "I want to feel safe," she said finally. "Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. I want to wake up in the morning without wondering if someone is going to hurt me. I want to work hard at something meaningful and know that my efforts matter. And I want—" She paused, gathering courage for the next part. "I want to love someone who loves me back, without fear or conditions or threats." Marcus reached for her hand. You have all of that here if you want it, for as long as you want it. What about you? What do you want? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the land that had shaped his entire life. I want to share this place with someone who understands what it means. I want to build something lasting, not just the ranch, but a family, a legacy. I want to wake up every morning knowing that the person beside me chose to be there. Their conversation was interrupted by Belle's sudden agitation in the pasture. The mare was pacing the fence line, ears pinned back and nostrils flaring in a way that both Eleanor and Marcus had learned to recognize as a warning. Marcus immediately stood and scanned the horizon with binoculars he kept on the porch for exactly this purpose. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of rolling hills and scattered trees, but then movement caught his eye near the tree line about half a mile away. "Someone's out there," he said quietly, "staying just inside the woods, but definitely watching the house." Elena felt her blood run cold. "Richard." "Can't tell from this distance, but Belle's never wrong about intruders." Marcus lowered the binoculars and reached for his phone. "I'm calling the sheriff." But before Marcus could complete the call, the electricity went out. The house was suddenly plunged into darkness, and in the distance they could hear the faint sound of an engine starting. "Generator," Marcus said tersely. "Someone cut the main power line." Elena's heart was racing as the reality of their situation became clear. Richard hadn't given up, he had simply changed tactics. Instead of relying on legal pressure or intimidation, he was now engaging in what amounted to a siege. Marcus moved with military precision, gathering supplies and weapons while explaining their options to Elena. "We can try to get to my truck and drive to town, but if he's watching the road, that could be dangerous. We can hole up in the house and wait for help, but if he cut the phone lines too, no one will know we're in trouble. What do you think we should do?" Before Marcus could answer, they heard a new sound that made both of them freeze, the distant sound of glass breaking coming from the direction of the barn. "He's trying to spook the animals," Marcus realized. "Drive them off or hurt them to get us to come outside." Elena felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. The horses and cattle on this ranch had become important to her over the past month. The thought of Richard hurting innocent animals to get to her was intolerable. "We can't let him hurt them," she said firmly. "Elena, that's exactly what he wants. He's trying to draw us out where he can control the situation. Then we don't give him control. We take it away from him." Marcus looked at her with surprise. This was a different Elena than the frightened woman he had found in his shed. This was someone who had been pushed too far and was ready to fight. "Back! What are you thinking?" Elena's plan was born from desperation and intimate knowledge of Richard's psychology. She understood his need to dominate and control, his belief that he was entitled to take whatever he wanted. But she also understood his weaknesses, his arrogance, his tendency to underestimate women, and his inability to imagine that his victims might fight back. "Richard expects me to run or hide," Elena explained. "He's planned for those responses, but what if I don't do what he expects? What if I go to him instead?" "Absolutely not. I'm not letting you anywhere near that psychopath. Marcus, listen to me. If I approach him directly, he'll be so focused on me that he won't be watching for you. You could get behind him, get the advantage." "It's too dangerous. If something goes wrong—" "Something is already wrong," Elena interrupted. "Richard isn't going to stop. Even if we get through tonight, even if the sheriff arrests him, he'll find a way to come back. The only way this ends is if we end it." Marcus saw the determination in Elena's eyes and realized that she was right. Richard Blackwood was the kind of predator who would never stop hunting his prey voluntarily. The only way to protect Elena, and any other women Richard might target in the future, was to stop him permanently. All right, Marcus said reluctantly. But we do this smart. No unnecessary risks, no heroics. We stick to the plan and we both come out of this alive. They spent 20 minutes preparing, gathering equipment and establishing communication protocols. Marcus would circle around through the woods to approach Richard from behind, while Elena would walk directly toward the barn to draw his attention. They synchronized their watches and agreed on signals they would use to coordinate their actions. As Elena prepared to leave the house, Marcus caught her hand. "Elena, after tomorrow we'll be married. I need you to promise me you'll be careful. Tonight, I want to have a wife to wake up next to, not a memory." Elena stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, putting all of her hopes for their future into that one gesture. "I promise. But Marcus, you promise me the same thing. I want a husband, not a hero." They separated at the back door of the house, Marcus disappearing into the darkness toward the woods, while Elena walked boldly toward the barn. Her heart was pounding, but her steps were steady. She was done running from Richard Blackwood. Elena found Richard exactly where she expected to, standing near the barn door with a crowbar in his hand, obviously having used it to break the windows. He had also managed to open several of the stall doors, and Thunder was pacing nervously in the barnyard, while Belle remained huddled in the corner of her stall. When Richard saw Elena approaching, his expression transformed into a mixture of triumph and rage that was terrifying to behold. "There she is," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "My runaway bride, finally coming home where she belongs." Elena stopped about 20 feet away from him, close enough to talk but far enough to run if necessary. "Hello, Richard. You're looking well. Stalking and breaking into other people's property seems to agree with you." Richard's smile was cold and predatory. "Always so clever with your words, Elena. That's what attracted me to you in the first place. But cleverness only gets you so far when you're dealing with someone who has real power. Is that what you think this is about? Power? Of course it's about power. You thought you could embarrass me, make me look like a fool, steal from me and disappear. But here's the thing about power, Elena. It always wins in the end." Elena could see movement in the shadows behind Richard, and she knew that Marcus was getting into position. She just needed to keep Richard talking for a few more minutes. "You're right about one thing," Elena said. "This is about power. But you're wrong about who has it." Richard laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, I'm the one holding the weapon, and you're the one who's about to come back to Chicago with me." "I'm not going anywhere with you, Richard. Not tonight, not ever." "Yes, you are. Because if you don't, I'm going to burn this whole place down with your boyfriend inside it. And then I'm going to track down your sister in Mexico and have a very unpleasant conversation with her about family loyalty." The threat against Maria made Elena's blood boil, but she forced herself to remain calm. Richard was trying to provoke her into doing something reckless, and she couldn't afford to take the bait. "You know what the difference is between you and—" "Marcus?" Elena asked conversationally. "What's that?" "Marcus asked me to marry him. You just assumed you owned me." Richard's expression darkened. "Marriage? You think a piece of paper is going to protect you from me?" "No," Elena said, her voice steady and strong. "I think this is." At that moment, Marcus emerged from the shadows behind Richard, moving with the silent efficiency of his military training. Richard sensed the movement and began to turn, but Marcus was already upon him. The struggle was brief, but violent. Richard was younger and desperate, but Marcus was stronger and better trained. Within moments, Marcus had wrestled the crowbar away from Richard and pinned him to the ground. "It's over, Blackwood," Marcus said, his knee pressed firmly against Richard's back. "You're done." Richard struggled uselessly against Marcus's superior strength, his face pressed into the dirt of the barnyard. "This isn't over," he gasped. "You can't watch her forever. I'll find another way." "No, you won't," Elena said, pulling out the cell phone she had been carrying, "because I've been recording this entire conversation. Every threat you made, every admission of your crimes, and Marcus wasn't the only one listening." As if summoned by her words, the sound of sirens filled the night air. Sheriff Davidson's SUV came racing up the driveway, followed by 2 other patrol cars and what appeared to be a federal vehicle. Richard's face went white as he realized the trap he had walked into. Elena hadn't just been stalling for time to let Marcus get into position. She had been gathering evidence while giving law enforcement time to arrive. "You called them," Richard said, his voice filled with disbelief and rage. "I called them the moment the power went out," Elena replied. "I told them you were here, told them about your threats, and asked them to listen in on the phone while I confronted you. Everything you said tonight was recorded by the sheriff's department." Sheriff Davidson approached with handcuffs already in his hands. "Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for stalking, criminal trespass, destruction of property, and making terroristic threats. You have the right to remain silent." As the sheriff read Richard his rights, Elena felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time in over a year, she was truly free from the fear that had dominated her life. Marcus stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Are you all right?" Elena nodded, but she was trembling now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Marcus immediately moved to her side, wrapping his arms around her and holding her while she processed what had just happened. "It's really over?" she asked. "It's really over," Marcus confirmed. "He's going to prison, Elena, for a long time." As they watched Richard being loaded into the back of a patrol car, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since she was a child: absolute safety. Not just physical safety, but the deep emotional security that came from knowing she was truly protected and loved. "We still have a wedding tomorrow," Marcus reminded her gently. Elena looked up at him, this man who had risked everything to protect her, who had offered her not just safety but genuine love and partnership. "Yes, we do," she said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him again. "And Marcus, this time I'm marrying you because I want to, not because I have to." The next afternoon, Elena Vasquez became Elena Riley in a simple ceremony at the Hawthorne Creek courthouse. As she spoke her vows to Marcus, promising to love and honor him for the rest of her life, Elena realized that her journey from mail-order bride to free woman was finally complete. But more than that, she had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most extraordinary destinations. She had found not just safety and legal protection, but genuine love with a man who valued her strength, respected her independence, and cherished her exactly as she was. As they drove back to the ranch as husband and wife, Elena looked out at the vast Montana landscape that was now truly her home and smiled. She had survived the worst that life could throw at her, and she had emerged stronger, braver, and more capable of love than she had ever imagined possible. The mail-order bride who had once felt like she had no choices had become a woman who could choose her own destiny, and she had chosen love, partnership, and a future filled with infinite possibilities under the endless Montana sky. 2 years later, Elena Riley stood in the kitchen of her Montana home, preparing lunch for the crew of volunteers who were helping to build the new barn. The old structure had been torn down 6 months after Richard's arrest, not because it was damaged, but because Elena couldn't stand looking at the place where her final confrontation with her past had occurred. Marcus had understood without explanation, and together they had designed a larger, more modern barn that would better serve their expanding operation. The ranch had grown considerably since their marriage. What had started as Marcus's modest cattle operation had evolved into a thriving business that included sustainable farming, a small horse rescue program, and most importantly, to Elena, a safe house network for women escaping domestic violence. Elena had used her experience and her newfound legal status to become an advocate for other women in situations similar to her own. The Safe House program had been Elena's idea, born from her understanding of how difficult it was for abuse victims to find genuine sanctuary. Working with local law enforcement and social services, the Riley Ranch had become an unofficial first stop for women who needed immediate safety while longer-term arrangements were made. Elena's ability to speak both English and Spanish, combined with her lived experience of trauma and recovery, made her uniquely qualified to help other survivors begin their healing journeys. "Mrs. Riley?" A voice from the doorway interrupted her thoughts. It belonged to Carmen Rodriguez, a 23-year-old woman who had arrived at the ranch 3 weeks earlier with her 4-year-old daughter Sophia. Carmen's husband had been arrested for domestic assault, but his family had threatened retaliation. If Carmen testified against him, Sheriff Davidson had brought her to the ranch while the district attorney's office worked on protective measures. "Please call me Elena," Elena replied with a warm smile. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Carmen said, though her voice still carried the cautious tone of someone not yet convinced of her safety. "Sophia wants to help feed the horses again. Is that all right?" "Of course. Marcus is out by the pasture if you want to join him. He loves teaching the children about the animals." Elena watched through the window as Carmen and Sophia made their way toward the pasture where Marcus was repairing a section of fence. The sight of the little girl's fearless approach to the horses reminded Elena of her own journey from terror to trust. Sophia had been withdrawn and nervous when she first arrived, but the open spaces and gentle animals of the ranch had worked their healing magic quickly. The transformation in Carmen was more gradual, but equally profound. She had arrived jumpy and hypervigilant, constantly looking over her shoulder and starting at unexpected sounds. But gradually, the peace and security of the ranch had allowed her natural personality to emerge. Elena had learned that Carmen was intelligent and funny, with a talent for gardening that had already improved their vegetable production significantly. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Maria, who was now studying nursing at a university in Guadalajara. The money that Elena was able to send home regularly, earned through her advocacy work and her partnership in the ranch, had transformed her family's circumstances dramatically. Their mother's health had improved with access to better medical care, and Maria was thriving in her studies. The text included a photo of Maria in her nursing uniform, accompanied by the message, "Thinking of you, Hermana. Can't wait to visit this summer and meet your famous husband." Elena smiled, remembering how shocked Maria had been when Elena had finally been able to call and explain everything that had happened. The conversation had been emotional and difficult, but it had also been healing. Maria understood now why Elena had disappeared so completely, and she was proud of the life her sister had built in Montana. The legal proceedings following Richard's arrest had been lengthy, but ultimately satisfying. Richard had been convicted on multiple charges, including stalking, human trafficking, and making terroristic threats. His sentence of 15 years in federal prison meant that Elena would be well into her 40s before she needed to worry about his release. More importantly, the conviction had opened doors for other victims to come forward. 3 other women had filed charges against Richard for similar crimes, and the marriage agency that had facilitated Elena's original trip to America had been shut down for its role in the trafficking operation. Elena's immigration status had been resolved completely through her marriage to Marcus and her cooperation with federal investigators. She was now a permanent resident with a clear path to citizenship, and she had used her legal stability to help other women navigate the complex intersection of immigration law and domestic violence protection. The sound of vehicles approaching the house drew Elena's attention back to the present. She recognized the pickup truck belonging to Tom Patterson, Marcus's neighbor, but the second vehicle was unfamiliar. A small sedan with what appeared to be an elderly woman behind the wheel. Elena walked out to the porch to greet the visitors, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. Tom climbed out of his truck with a grin, followed by a woman Elena had never seen before. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded Elena immediately of Mrs. Henderson. "Elena, I'd like you to meet Dorothy Patterson," Tom said. "My aunt from Denver. She's been wanting to meet you ever since I told her about the work you're doing here." Eleanor felt a shock of recognition as the woman approached. This was Dorothy, the elderly passenger she had met on the bus during her escape from Chicago 2 years earlier. The woman who had given her comfort during the darkest period of her life and whose daughter's phone number Elena still kept in her wallet. "Dorothy," Elena said, her voice filled with amazement. "I can't believe it's really you." Dorothy's face lit up with recognition and joy. "Elena, oh my goodness, look at you. You look wonderful, strong and happy and healthy. I knew you were going to be all right." The two women embraced, and Elena felt a profound sense of completion. Dorothy had been present at the beginning of her journey to freedom, offering kindness and hope when Elena had desperately needed both. Having her here now, seeing the life Elena had built, felt like the closing of a circle. "I had no idea you were Tom's aunt," Elena said, as they sat on the porch with glasses of iced tea. "I had no idea the woman Tom kept talking about was the same brave girl I met on that bus," Dorothy replied. "When he told me about Elena Riley and her work with domestic violence survivors, I thought the name sounded familiar, but it wasn't until he showed me a photograph that I realized it was you." They spent the afternoon catching up with Dorothy, sharing news about her grandchildren, and Elena describing the changes in her life. Dorothy was particularly interested in the Safe House program, and she listened intently as Elena explained how they vetted potential residents and worked with law enforcement to ensure everyone's safety. "You know," Dorothy said thoughtfully, "my daughter Linda has been looking for ways to expand her counseling practice. She specializes in trauma therapy, and she's been wanting to work more with domestic violence survivors. Maybe we could arrange for her to visit and see if there might be some way to collaborate." Elena felt a surge of excitement at the possibility. One of the biggest challenges in their program was providing professional counseling services to the women who stayed at the ranch. Having access to a specialized trauma therapist would be invaluable. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus returned from his work in the pasture, accompanied by Carmen and Sophia. Eleanor watched with pride as Marcus introduced himself to Dorothy with the same quiet dignity that had first attracted her to him. Carmen was more reserved, but Elena could see that she was curious about this new visitor who seemed to bring such joy to Elena's face. That evening, after Dorothy and Tom had left and Carmen and Sophia had retired to their cabin, Elena and Marcus sat on their porch, discussing the day's events. "It's amazing how life brings people back together when you need them," Marcus observed. "Dorothy showing up today, right when we're trying to expand the program. That can't be a coincidence." Elena curled up against his side, grateful for the solid warmth of his presence. "I keep thinking about something Dorothy said to me on that bus. She told me I was stronger than I knew, and that sometimes we don't discover our strength until we're forced to use it. She was right about that. But Elena, you've done more than just discover your strength. You've used it to help other people find theirs." Elena thought about Carmen, who had progressed from barely speaking to actively participating in ranch activities. She thought about the 6 other women who had stayed at the ranch over the past year, each of whom had eventually moved on to rebuild their lives in safety. She thought about the advocacy work she was doing with state legislators to improve protections. For domestic violence survivors. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never found your shed that night, Elena said. If I had kept running, tried to disappear somewhere else. Marcus tightened his arms around her. I don't think you would have kept running much longer. You're not someone who stays hidden when you have the power to help others. You would have found your way to this work eventually, with or without me. But I'm glad it was with you, Elena said, tilting her head up to look at him. I'm glad I found someone who sees helping others as just as important as building a life together. As they sat together, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as Elena Vasquez, a desperate young woman willing to travel to a foreign country to marry a stranger for the chance at a better life. She had endured months of abuse and terror as Richard's prisoner. She had become a fugitive, sleeping in strangers' sheds and stealing food to survive. But through all of those experiences, she had been becoming Elena Riley, a woman strong enough to fight for her freedom, compassionate enough to help others find theirs, and brave enough to build a love that was based on choice rather than desperation. The mail-order bride, who had once felt like she had no options, had become a woman who created options for others. The frightened refugee who had hidden in a tool, she had become an advocate who testified before legislative committees. The abuse survivor who had faked her own death had become someone who helped other women choose life. As Marcus carried her inside and they prepared for bed in the home they had built together, Elena smiled at the thought that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, and new chances to prove that love, freely given, was the most powerful force in the world. The girl who had once answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride had found something far more valuable than the marriage she had originally sought. She had found herself, her purpose, and a love that would last a lifetime under the endless Montana sky. 5 years had passed since Elena first woke up in Marcus Riley's tool shed, and the woman standing before the Montana State Legislative Committee bore little resemblance to the terrified refugee who had once hidden among horse blankets. Elena Riley adjusted the microphone at the witness table, her confident posture and clear voice commanding the attention of lawmakers who had gathered to hear testimony on the Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act. Honorable committee members, Elena began, her slight accent adding gravity to her words rather than diminishing her authority. My name is Elena Riley, and I am here today not just as an advocate, but as someone who has lived the reality we are discussing. The committee room was packed with reporters, advocates and survivors. In the front row sat Marcus, wearing his best suit and looking every inch the successful rancher and businessman he had become. Beside him sat Carmen Rodriguez, now a certified victim advocate herself, holding the hand of her daughter Sophia, who at 9 years old had grown into a confident child with no memory of fear. Elena's testimony was the culmination of 3 years of advocacy work that had begun small and grown into a statewide movement. What started as an informal network of safe houses had evolved into a comprehensive program that addressed not just immediate safety needs, but long-term recovery, legal support, and economic independence for survivors. The current system requires victims to navigate a maze of bureaucracy while their abusers use every tool available to maintain control, Eleanor continued. This legislation would create a single point of contact, streamline protective services, and most importantly, recognize that survival is not just about escaping violence. It's about rebuilding entire lives. Elena's voice carried the weight of personal experience as she described the gaps in the system that she had witnessed firsthand. She spoke about women who had been forced to choose between deportation and returning to abusive partners. She described survivors who had lost custody of their children because they couldn't prove their abuse. She painted a picture of a system that, while well-intentioned, often failed the very people it was designed to protect. "I was fortunate," Elena said, her eyes finding Marcus in the audience. "I found safety through the kindness of strangers and the determination to survive, but legislation should not rely on luck or the charity of individuals. It should provide systematic protection and support for every person who needs it." The questions from committee members were thoughtful and detailed, reflecting the months of preparation that Elena and her team had invested in crafting this legislation. She answered each inquiry with the expertise of someone who had not only lived through the experience, but had spent years studying policy solutions. When asked about the economic impact of her proposed programs, Elena pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "Senator Williams, the cost of implementing these protections is significant, but the cost of not implementing them is far greater. Every woman who remains trapped in an abusive relationship represents lost productivity, increased healthcare costs, and often intergenerational trauma that affects children and communities for decades." Elena's presentation included testimonials from the 37 women who had stayed at the Riley Ranch over the past 4 years. Each story was different backgrounds, different types of abuse, different paths to recovery, but they all shared common themes of needing more than just temporary shelter to rebuild their lives. Maria Santos arrived at our ranch with 3 children and a 7th-grade education, Elena read from her notes. Today, she owns a successful catering business in Billings and employs 6 people. Jennifer Kim came to us speaking no English and suffering from PTSD so severe she couldn't sleep indoors. She now works as a translator for the county court system, helping other immigrant women navigate legal proceedings. The committee chairman, Senator Patricia Harris, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Ms. Riley, your program has achieved remarkable success rates. What do you attribute that to?" Elena had anticipated this question, and her answer reflected years of careful observation and analysis. "Senator Harris, I believe our success comes from recognizing that healing from trauma requires time, safety, and genuine choice. We don't impose timelines on our residents. We don't require them to follow predetermined paths to recovery. We provide resources and support, and we let each woman determine her own journey forward." The hearing concluded with Elena's most personal testimony. She spoke about the night she had fled Mrs. Henderson's ranch, convinced that she would spend the rest of her life running from Richard Blackwood. She described the desperation that had driven her to sleep in a stranger's shed and the miracle of finding not just safety, but love and purpose. "This legislation isn't just about funding programs or streamlining services," Elena said in closing. "It's about recognizing that every person deserves the chance to choose their own life. It's about creating a society where survival doesn't depend on luck, where safety isn't a privilege, and where every person has the opportunity to transform their pain into purpose." The committee voted unanimously to advance the legislation to the full Senate, but Elena barely heard the announcement. As she stepped down from the witness table, she was surrounded by reporters asking for interviews and advocates wanting to discuss implementation details. But all Elena could see was Marcus, making his way through the crowd with a smile that spoke of pride, love, and shared accomplishment. "How does it feel to be a legislative advocate?" Marcus asked, as they finally escaped the crowd and walked toward their truck in the Capitol parking lot. "Terrifying and exhilarating," Elena admitted. 5 years ago, I couldn't imagine speaking to one person in authority without fear. Today, I testified before the state legislature about changing laws that affect thousands of people." They drove home through the Montana countryside in comfortable silence, both processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The landscape rolled past their windows, The same vast expanses of grassland and sky that had first offered Elena sanctuary, now witnessed to her transformation into a voice for change. Their ranch had changed dramatically since Elena's early days. The original house had been expanded to include office space for Elena's advocacy work and guest quarters for visiting family members. The new barn housed not only their livestock, but also a workshop where residents learned practical skills like welding, carpentry, and engine repair. Most significantly, they had purchased an adjacent property and converted it into permanent transitional housing. Women who had completed their initial recovery could remain in the community while pursuing education, starting businesses, or establishing independent households. The program had become a model studied by advocates from across the country. As they pulled into their driveway, Elena noticed a familiar car parked near the main house. Her sister Maria emerged from the passenger side, followed by a man Elena didn't recognize. Maria had finished nursing school the previous year and was now working at a trauma center in Denver, specializing in domestic violence cases. "Surprise!" Maria called out, running toward Elena with the same enthusiasm she had shown as a child. "I wanted to be here when you made history." Elena hugged her sister tightly, marveling at how much they had both changed. Maria was now a confident professional, fluent in English and passionate about her work. The scared girl Elena had left behind in Guadalajara had become a woman dedicated to healing others. "Elena, I want you to meet David Chen," Maria said, gesturing toward her companion. "He's a documentary filmmaker who's been following domestic violence legislation across the country. He wants to tell our story." David stepped forward with a respectful smile. "Miss Riley, I've been documenting the impact of grassroots advocacy on legislative change. Your story, from surviving trafficking to becoming a legislative advocate, represents something remarkable about the American system's capacity for change." Elena felt a familiar hesitation about sharing her story publicly, but Marcus's encouraging presence and Maria's obvious excitement helped her overcome it. Over the past 5 years, she had learned that her personal experience, while painful to discuss, had the power to create understanding and support for other survivors. That evening, as the extended family gathered for dinner, Elena found herself reflecting on the unexpected turns her life had taken. The table was full of voices and laughter. Marcus describing the committee hearing to Tom Patterson and his wife, Maria updating them on their mother's improving health, Carmen discussing her plans to attend law school, and Sophia chattering about her horse-riding lessons. David, the filmmaker, sat quietly observing the interactions with the trained eye of someone accustomed to finding meaning in everyday moments. After dinner, he approached Elena with a thoughtful expression. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," David said, "but what strikes me most about your story isn't just your survival. It's how you've transformed your experience into a force for systemic change. Most people who go through what you went through would be satisfied with building a safe, quiet life. You've chosen to put yourself in the public eye to help others." Elena considered his observation. "I think once you understand what it feels like to have no choices, you become passionate about creating choices for other people. I can't undo what happened to me, but I can help ensure that other women have better options than I did." Later that night, as Elena and Marcus prepared for bed in their expanded bedroom that now included a sitting area and Elena's desk where she prepared legislative testimony, Marcus brought up a subject they had been discussing for months. "Elena, I know we've talked about this before, but with everything going so well with the legislation and the program, do you think it might be time to think about expanding our family?" Elena paused in brushing her hair, meeting Marcus's eyes. In the mirror, they had been married for 4 years, and their relationship had grown stronger with each challenge they had faced together. The question of children had come up periodically, But Elena had always felt that her work with the shelter required all of her emotional energy. "I've been thinking about that too," Elena said softly. "Watching Sophia grow up here, seeing how the ranch has healed her and Carmen, it makes me think about what kind of mother I might be." Marcus moved behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "You would be an amazing mother. You've already been a maternal figure to dozens of women who have stayed here. But Eleanor, I want you to know that if you decide you'd rather focus on the advocacy work, I'm completely supportive of that choice too." Elena turned to face him, struck once again by his unwavering support for her autonomy and choices. "That's exactly why I think I might be ready. Because you've never pressured me, never assumed that marriage automatically meant motherhood. You've let me discover what I want, instead of telling me what I should want." They talked late into the night about their dreams for the future, the possibility of children, the expansion of their programs, Elena's potential run for state legislature that several party leaders had suggested. As they finally settled into sleep, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. She thought about the young woman who had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride, hoping to escape poverty and find security. She thought about the prisoner who had endured months of abuse while planning her escape. She thought about the refugee who had slept in barns and survived on stolen canned goods. And she thought about the advocate who had testified before the state legislature that very day, speaking with the authority of someone who had transformed her worst experiences into a force for positive change. The mail-order bride who had once felt powerless had become a woman who shaped policy and changed lives. The victim who had faked her own death had become someone who helped others choose life. The immigrant who had been threatened with deportation had become a voice in the American political system. As Elena drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who had first offered her safety and had become her partner in every sense of the word, she smiled at the thought that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to use her voice, her experience, and her hard-won wisdom to create a world where no woman would have to choose between survival and freedom. The story that had begun with a desperate flight from Chicago had become a testament to the power of human resilience, the importance of genuine love, and the possibility of transforming personal pain into collective progress. Elena Riley had not just survived her ordeal, she had used it to build a life dedicated to ensuring that other women would have better choices, stronger protections, and the support they needed to write their own stories of survival and success. In the end, the mail-order bride had found something far more valuable than the marriage she had originally sought. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her power to change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.